You noticed it before you had a word for it. A quiet distance between you and everyone else. Not dramatic, not painful at first, just there, like a thin glass wall. You could see people, talk to them, laugh with them, but something always stayed untouched. Even as a child, you sensed it. You listened more than you spoke. You observed how people changed depending on who was in a room. You picked up contradictions early, what they said versus what they did, what they claimed to value versus what actually guided their decisions. While others were busy participating, you were busy noticing. That's usually where it starts. Intelligent people don't suddenly become lonely one day. Loneliness doesn't arrive as an event. It forms slowly as a pattern, a background feeling, a realization that keeps returning no matter how many rooms you enter or how many conversations you join. You might have had friends. You might still have them. But there was always a sense that the connection stopped at a certain depth. Conversations repeated themselves. Emotions felt recycled. Jokes followed predictable paths. Over time, you began to recognize the structure underneath social interaction. And once you see structure, spontaneity fades. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Most people assume loneliness comes from rejection, from being excluded, from not being chosen. But for intelligent people, loneliness often appears in the opposite situation, when you are included, yet still feel separate. You're there, but not fully engaged. Present, but internally distant. Not because you think you're better, not because you dislike people, but because your mind doesn't rest where most conversations live. You don't just hear words. You hear intent. You don't just see actions. You see patterns. You don't just experience moments. You anticipate outcomes. And anticipation changes everything. When you already know where a conversation is going, it stops feeling like connection and starts feeling like maintenance. When you already understand why someone behaves a certain way, empathy quietly replaces curiosity. And curiosity is what bonds people. This creates a subtle isolation most people never notice because they never experience it. You start feeling out of sync, not smarter, not superior, just misaligned. Others bond through shared distractions. You search for shared understanding. Others feel close through frequency. You need depth. Others feel fulfilled by being surrounded. You feel fulfilled by being understood. And understanding is rare. So you adapt. You simplify your responses. You laugh at the right moments. You nod when expected. You become socially functional. From the outside, you look connected, even confident, even calm. But inside, something withdraws. You stop explaining your thoughts fully, not because you can't, but because you've learned most people don't want the full version. You stop sharing questions that don't have clean answers. You stop bringing up ideas that disrupt comfort, not out of bitterness, out of efficiency. Over time, this creates a strange contradiction. You're capable of deep connection, yet surrounded by shallow ones. You're mentally active, yet emotionally restrained. You're socially present, yet internally alone. And the loneliest part isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of resonance. You rarely meet minds that meet you where you are. So your mind learns to stay where it's safe, inside itself. That's the silent pattern. Not loneliness as lack, but loneliness as surplus. Too much awareness, too much perception, too much clarity in a world that functions. At a certain point, intelligence stops being a skill and starts becoming a filter. It changes how you interpret people, not emotionally, but structurally. You no longer take behavior at face value. When someone speaks, you notice why they're speaking. When they joke, you notice what they're avoiding. When they express confidence, you sense what insecurity is being compensated for. This isn't cynicism. It's pattern recognition. And pattern recognition quietly dismantles social magic. Most social connection relies on a shared illusion that interactions are spontaneous, genuine, and emotionally neutral. Intelligent people struggle with this illusion because they see repetition everywhere. The same emotional scripts, the same conversational loops, the same predictable reactions recycled across different faces. At first, this awareness feels empowering. You understand people more quickly. You read rooms effortlessly. You avoid obvious social traps. But over time, something shifts. When behavior becomes predictable, it stops being engaging. When motives become visible, they stop being charming. Small talk becomes exhausting not because it's shallow, but because it's pre-programmed. You already know where it leads. You know which response will be rewarded, which silence will create tension, which opinion will be accepted. So participating starts to feel like acting. And acting, even when you're good at it, creates distance. This is where loneliness deepens. Not because you lack social skill, but because you possess too much awareness of how social dynamics work. You can't unsee the mechanics. You can't return to naive participation. For most people, conversation is a way to connect. For you, it often becomes a way to observe. You notice how people seek validation more than understanding. How they speak to be affirmed, not challenged. How disagreement feels threatening, not because ideas are weak, but because identities are fragile. So you adapt again. You start filtering your thoughts in real time. You simplify complex ideas. You avoid topics that require sustained attention. You keep things light, not because you prefer lightness, but because depth often creates discomfort, and discomfort breaks social flow. This creates an invisible gap. Others feel comfortable around you, but not connected to you. They enjoy your presence without knowing you. They experience the version of you that fits into the rhythm of the group. Meanwhile, the part of you that thinks deeply, questions constantly, and notices inconsistencies stays unexpressed. Not hidden, just unused. This is the quiet cost of intelligence in social spaces. You don't struggle to communicate. You restrain yourself from doing it fully. You don't feel misunderstood. You preempt misunderstanding by staying incomplete. And over time, this restraint becomes habit. You begin to sense that most interactions are transactional. Emotional exchanges with expected returns. Attention traded for validation. Agreement traded for belonging. Once you recognize this, it becomes difficult to feel present in conversations that revolve around maintaining these exchanges. So you drift, not away from people, but away from emotional investment. You remain polite. You remain functional, but you stop expecting resonance where it rarely exists. And that's when loneliness stops being situational and becomes structural. It's no longer about who is around you. It's about how your mind processes human behavior. Intelligence doesn't isolate you by making you different. It isolates you by making things too clear. And clarity in social life often comes at the cost of closeness. As your awareness grows, so does a quiet tension between what you feel and what the world is prepared to meet. You experience emotions with layers, not just happiness or sadness, but the reasons beneath them, the contradictions, the aftereffects. You don't simply feel something, you analyze it while feeling it. That depth becomes part of your internal language. Most people don't operate there. Social life, for the most part, runs on efficiency. Emotions are exchanged quickly, acknowledged briefly, then replaced. There's an unspoken agreement to keep things moving, to avoid lingering too long on anything that might slow the rhythm. But depth doesn't move quickly. When you try to share something meaningful, you often sense the shift, the pause, the subtle discomfort. People listen, but they don't follow. They acknowledge, but they don't enter. The moment passes, and the conversation drifts back to safer ground. Over time, you learn what happens when you go too deep. You're met with silence, nervous humor, or polite disengagement. So you adjust. You begin holding parts of yourself back, not because they're unimportant, but because they don't fit the social environment. You shorten your explanations. You translate complex feelings into simple phrases. You say, "I'm fine," when the truth would require context most people aren't willing to sit with. This creates an emotional mismatch. You crave conversations that continue rather than conclude, connections that evolve rather than reset. But social reality rewards closure, not exploration. It favors clarity over complexity, certainty over curiosity. So relationships start feeling unfinished. Not broken, not bad, just incomplete. You can spend hours with someone and still feel untouched. You can share experiences without sharing understanding. You can be emotionally present without being emotionally met. and that gap accumulates. The more emotionally layered you are, the harder it becomes to find spaces where those layers are welcome. You're not asking for intensity, you're asking for sincerity, for attention that doesn't retreat when things stop being simple. But simplicity is comfortable. Depth requires effort. So most people don't follow you there. Eventually, you stop inviting them. You choose silence over simplification, solitude over dilution, not because you reject people, but because you refuse to reduce yourself to be digestible. This isn't isolation driven by ego. It's self-preservation. You realize that forcing depth where it isn't wanted leads to disappointment. That emotional exposure without emotional reciprocity leaves you drained. That explaining yourself repeatedly to those who can't or won't understand feels like erosion. So you become selective. You speak less. You listen more. You wait for signs of genuine curiosity before opening up. And when those signs don't appear, you remain contained. From the outside, this looks like withdrawal. From the inside, it feels like control. But control has a cost. The fewer people you fully engage with, the quieter your world becomes. Not empty, just sparse. You begin living with many thoughts that never leave your mind, many emotions that never find expression. And while solitude can be peaceful, prolonged emotional solitude carries weight. You don't feel lonely because no one is around. You feel lonely because no one arrives at the depth you already inhabit. This is the conflict intelligent people live with. A mind capable of profound connection, operating in a social environment optimized for surface interaction. And the longer this conflict persists, the more natural loneliness begins to feel. There's a moment, usually quiet, usually unspoken, when awareness stops feeling like insight and starts feeling like loss. You begin to realize that understanding changes your relationship with comfort. Once you see how people construct their identities, you can't fully believe in them anymore. Once you recognize how emotions are shaped by fear, desire, and social reward, they stop feeling pure. Once you understand how narratives protect egos, you stop being moved by them. This isn't emotional numbness. It's perceptual clarity. And clarity removes illusions. Most people rely on small, stabilizing beliefs to stay emotionally balanced. They believe their relationships are as deep as they feel, that intentions matter more than outcomes, that people act randomly rather than predictably. These beliefs aren't stupid. They're functional. They allow life to feel lighter, interactions to feel meaningful without constant evaluation, disappointments to feel temporary rather than structural. But awareness dismantles these cushions. You notice how often kindness is conditional, how frequently honesty is strategic, how rarely people tolerate perspectives that challenge their self-image. You stop taking reassurance at face value. You stop finding comfort in general explanations. You begin tracing causes instead of accepting stories. And with every layer of understanding, something familiar disappears. Ignorance doesn't just hide truth, it preserves ease. Awareness doesn't just reveal truth, it removes shelter. This is why intelligence often feels heavier with time. Not because the mind weakens, but because it carries more unresolved information. You don't get the luxury of emotional shortcuts. You see consequences before choices are made. You recognize patterns before they complete themselves. And anticipation dulls hope. You stop being surprised by disappointment. You expect misalignment before it appears. You sense distance forming long before words change. So you prepare. You lower expectations. You reduce emotional exposure. You detach slightly, not to avoid pain entirely, but to keep it manageable. But detachment has side effects. It reduces emotional intensity. It creates internal distance. It makes moments feel quieter than they should. Even joy arrives filtered, moderated by understanding. You're rarely devastated, but you're rarely carried away. And while this stability looks like strength, it often feels like isolation. Because awareness doesn't just separate you from others. It separates you from earlier versions of yourself. You remember when things felt simpler, when people surprised you, when connection didn't require analysis. when trust wasn't cautious. That version of you isn't coming back. Once you understand how much of human behavior is driven by unconscious patterns, you can't return to innocence. You can't unsee motivations. You can't unlearn dynamics. So you stand in a strange position, too aware to be fully immersed, too human to be unaffected. This is the cost intelligent people rarely talk about. Not the loss of happiness, but the loss of illusion. An illusion, for better or worse, is what allows many people to feel connected without friction. Without it, you navigate relationships with clarity but little cushioning. And over time, that clarity begins to feel lonely. After a while, effort starts to feel asymmetrical. You notice that you're the one adjusting, the one translating thoughts, the one softening ideas, the one making space. And slowly, a question forms, not out loud, but internally. Why am I doing all the work? Intelligent people don't stop trying because they become arrogant. They stop trying because repeated misalignment teaches them something most people never have to learn. That connection, when forced, becomes self-erasure. At first, you compensate. You explain more carefully. You choose words with precision. You give context. You anticipate misunderstandings before they happen. You over-clarify, not to dominate the conversation, but to protect it from collapsing. But over time, you realize something uncomfortable. Most people aren't meeting you halfway. They're waiting for you to come closer. So you do, again and again, until the cost becomes visible. You feel drained after interactions that should feel neutral. You notice relief when plans are canceled. You enjoy solitude, not because it's exciting, but because it's quiet, mentally quiet. This is when withdrawal begins. Not dramatic withdrawal, not disappearing, just less effort. You respond later. You speak less. You let conversations end instead of extending them. You stop initiating depth where it isn't invited. And something surprising happens. Nothing collapses. Most relationships continue exactly as they were because they were never built on mutual depth to begin with. They were built on proximity, routine, and shared distraction. This realization is sobering. You see that your presence was never fully required, only your participation. And participation, unlike connection, is replaceable. So you become selective, not intentionally, not strategically, but naturally. You invest energy only where curiosity flows both ways, where silence isn't awkward, where complexity isn't immediately simplified for comfort, where disagreement doesn't feel like threat. These spaces are rare, so your social world shrinks, not because you reject people, but because you stop stretching yourself to fit where you don't belong. From the outside, this looks like detachment, sometimes even coldness. From the inside, it feels like alignment. You're no longer trying to be understood by everyone. You're no longer explaining your inner world to those who can't enter it. You're no longer confusing social approval with emotional safety. This doesn't make you immune to loneliness, but it changes its texture. Loneliness stops feeling like failure and starts feeling like a trade-off. Fewer connections, but less distortion. Fewer conversations, but more honesty, at least with yourself. You accept that depth narrows the field. That awareness reduces numbers. That clarity filters people out, whether you intend it or not. And once you accept that, trying indiscriminately no longer makes sense. You don't stop wanting connection. You stop chasing it in places where it cannot exist. That's when effort turns inward. You think more, reflect more, build an internal world that doesn't require constant translation. And while this inner world can be rich, it also becomes quiet, sometimes uncomfortably so, because effort was never just about others. It was about hope. And when intelligent people stop trying, it's often because hope has learned its limits that, at some point, loneliness stops feeling like an enemy and starts feeling like information. Not a flaw, not a punishment, a signal. Most people treat loneliness as something to escape, as evidence that something is missing or broken. So they fill it quickly, with noise, with activity, with relationships that offer proximity without alignment. But intelligent people sense that forced connection creates a different kind of damage. You've already learned what happens when you ignore internal signals. You've experienced the exhaustion of maintaining bonds that never quite reach you. You felt the quiet resentment that builds when you give more clarity than you receive. So loneliness begins to feel honest. It tells you when your environment doesn't match your inner life, when your mind is operating at a depth your surroundings can't sustain, when connection would require reduction rather than expansion. In that sense, loneliness isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of distortion. You're no longer pretending to feel fulfilled by interactions that don't nourish you. You're no longer mistaking familiarity for understanding. You're no longer negotiating your inner complexity for social ease. This doesn't make loneliness comfortable, but makes it clean. There's a difference between loneliness that corrodes and loneliness that clarifies. The first comes from neglect. The second comes from alignment. Intelligent people often experience the second, but mistake it for the first. So they try to fix it. They re-enter spaces they've already outgrown. They reconnect with people who never truly met them. They explain themselves again, hoping something has changed. It rarely has. And each attempt confirms the same thing. The discomfort isn't caused by being alone. It's caused by being misplaced. When you accept this, loneliness loses its urgency. It no longer demands immediate resolution. It becomes something you observe rather than escape. You stop asking, "How do I get rid of this?" and start asking, "What is this protecting me from?" Often, the answer is dilution. Loneliness protects you from spreading yourself thin, from constant emotional translation, from performing relatability instead of living honestly. It preserves the integrity of your internal world, even when that world feels quiet. This is why intelligent people often feel more at peace alone than surrounded by the wrong company. Solitude allows coherence. Thought flows without interruption. Emotions settle without being reshaped for approval. But peace doesn't eliminate longing. You still want connection, but not at any cost. Not connection that requires you to mute parts of yourself. Not connection that survives only as long as you stay simplified. So you wait. Not passively, but attentively. You remain open without being eager, available without being exposed. You let loneliness exist without rushing to cure it. This is where most people misunderstand intelligent solitude. They see isolation. You experience discernment. They assume absence. You experience boundary. Loneliness, in this context, isn't something to overcome. It's something to understand. Because the moment you treat it as a problem, you start solving the wrong equation. There is no moment where this resolves cleanly. No realization that suddenly places you among people who think like you. No environment that perfectly matches your internal pace. No final understanding that makes loneliness disappear. What changes instead is how you relate to it. You stop expecting to belong everywhere. You stop assuming connection is something owed by proximity. You stop mistaking rarity for defect. Your world becomes smaller, but sharper. You recognize fewer people, but more clearly. You listen less for validation and more for signal. You notice who asks questions without trying to redirect the answer. Who tolerates silence without filling it. Who can sit with complexity without needing to simplify it. These people are uncommon. So most of the time, you remain alone, not isolated but unaccompanied. You think without interruption. You feel without immediate explanation.